Officer Seu Kone stood tall beneath the scorching sun, surrounded by rows of fellow officers in faded uniforms. He was just one man in a sea of silence. But in a single moment, he did what no one else dared, he spoke the truth. 20 years in the force. 20 years of broken-down patrol cars, of worn-out boots he had to buy himself, of promises made and never kept. But this time, when the Minister of Security stood before them, bragging about reforms and equipment that never arrived, Kone stepped forward. No salute. No permission. Just a steady voice that cut through the lies like a blade. In front of the entire station, he exposed the rut, missing funds, expired gear, ambulances on bricks, officers walking on patrol because there was no fuel. And for that truth, he paid the price. Within the hour, he was stripped of his badge, his uniform, his identity. Fired on the spot. No pension. No dignity. Left standing in his socks while his colleagues watched in silence. It should have ended there. That's how these stories usually go. The powerful silence the brave. The system protects its own. But not this time. Because someone recorded everything, because one rookie officer had the courage to upload the truth, and because that truth reached the one man who could change everything. When President Ibrahim Traoré saw the video, what he did next didn't just shock the country, it ignited a revolution. The morning heat in Ouagadougou was relentless, baking the cracked pavement of the Central Police Precinct as 50 officers stood stiffly in formation. Among them was Officer Seu Kone, beret tilted, back straight, but stomach twisting with a familiar mix of hunger and tension. He had worn this badge for 2 decades. 20 long years of service, sacrifice, and silent frustration. He remembered chasing criminals in patrol cars that broke down every week. He remembered borrowing money to buy his own boots because the station ran out of supplies. He remembered biting his tongue every time another promise from the top went unfulfilled. But today, something inside him was done being silent. They were all gathered for a visit from Minister Dio, the man in charge of national security. 6 months earlier, Dio had stood in that same courtyard and announced a bold modernization plan. He'd promised new equipment, higher pay, functioning radios, and safe streets. The budget had been approved. The funds transferred. But nothing had changed. Every officer in that courtyard knew the truth, the system was rigged. The promised upgrades had never arrived. The only thing that had increased was their exhaustion. Yet no one dared say a word. Fear hung over the precinct like a storm cloud. Then came the rumble of SUVs, sleek, black, government-plated. The convoy pulled into the courtyard, tires spitting up clouds of dust. Out stepped Minister Dio in a designer suit, his shoes gleaming, the scent of imported cologne trailing behind him. He strutted to the podium, smiling like a man hosting a party. And then he began. He spoke of progress, of success, of gratitude for our heroes in uniform. He cracked jokes. He praised himself. He claimed that millions had been spent to modernize the force, even as the men standing before him wore taped-up boots and patched uniforms. That was when it happened. Seu Kone stepped out of line. No salute. No clearance. Just a quiet walk toward the podium, stopping 5 feet from the minister. The courtyard froze. Even the traffic in the background seemed to vanish into silence. Dio stopped mid-sentence, clearly irritated. He gave Kone a dismissive glance. Like someone swatting away a fly. But what came next wasn't a disruption. It was a reckoning. Seu's voice didn't shout, but it hit like thunder. Calm. Controlled. Carved from decades of swallowed injustice. You said we have new radios. We don't. You said we have new gear. We don't. We have windows broken since last year, ambulances without wheels, and rookies taping their boots. Where did the money go, sir? He pointed to Dio's golden watch. While we walk patrols with no fuel, your tires shine. For 10 minutes, he spoke, not with anger, but with purpose. He listed facts, figures, names, and dates. The corruption. The cover-ups. The consequences. The courtyard was heavy with disbelief. And when he finally stopped, it wasn't applause that followed. It was silence. Crushing silence. Dio's face darkened. His pride wounded, his authority challenged, he didn't even try to argue. He turned to the station commander and gave a single order. Strip him. Fire him. Now. The commander, a decent man once, hesitated. But with 3 kids in private school and a mortgage, he obeyed. 2 guards grabbed Seu. They pulled off his badge. Took his gun. Even made him remove his boots, claiming they were government property. Seu didn't resist. He stood in his socks, staring straight ahead. Dio laughed. Let the people see what happens to traitors, he said, getting into his air-conditioned SUV. Let him walk home. And just like that, after 20 years of service, Seu Kone was left with nothing but a plastic bag of personal items and the weight of humiliation. No one spoke. No one dared meet his eyes. His fellow officers, his brothers, were too scared. He walked home alone. As Officer Seu Kone sat in silence at home, trying to figure out how to feed his family without a job, someone else was making a decision that would change everything. Malik, a young rookie officer barely out of training, was at the back of the formation that morning. He had watched the entire confrontation unfold, from the moment Seu stepped forward to the brutal stripping of his uniform. He had stood frozen like the others, too afraid to move. But while everyone kept their heads down, Malik had recorded it all. Shaky hands, blurry footage, muffled audio, but the truth was there. The rage in Seu's voice. The silence of the crowd. The venom in Dio's laugh. It was raw, it was real, and it was powerful. That night, Malik sat in a cheap internet cafe. The walls were yellowed from heat and smoke, the Wi-Fi painfully slow. His finger hovered over the post button. He knew what this meant. Uploading that video could cost him his job. Maybe even his freedom. But he couldn't forget the sound of Velcro tearing as they ripped the badge off a 20-year veteran. He couldn't forget how no one had stood up for the man who dared to speak the truth. So, Malik created a fake account. He uploaded the video to Facebook and TikTok, writing just 7 words. They stripped him for speaking the truth. Within the first hour, barely anything happened. A few likes. A couple of shares. Malik started to regret it. Maybe no one would care. But then, something shifted. A well-known influencer from Ouagadougou reposted it. Then a popular local rapper shared it on his Instagram story with the caption, "This is why our heroes are dying in silence." And that was the spark. Within 3 hours, the video exploded. It flooded timelines. It reached corners of the internet Malik didn't even know existed. Comments poured in by the hundreds, then thousands. This is what's wrong with our country. Officer Kone is a lion among sheep. How can a minister treat a veteran like this? Tag after tag after tag, local media outlets, politicians, international reporters. Malik stared at the screen, stunned, watching the numbers climb. 10,000 views. 50,000, 300,000. Barbershops started replaying the video on loop. Taxi radios buzzed with conversations about the officer who stood up to the big man. Market vendors discussed it between sales. The footage even reached neighboring countries, as activists across West Africa picked it up. But perhaps the most important person of all was just sitting down for a late dinner when his aide burst into the room, tablet in hand, out of breath. "Mr. President. You need to see this." President Ibrahim Traoré, leader of Burkina Faso, paused his work. He wasn't the kind of man who was easily rattled. But as he watched the shaky video, Officer Seu Kone pointing at broken windows and asking, "Where did the money go?" Something in his eyes changed. He didn't say a word. He didn't finish his dinner. He watched the video again. Then a third time. And when it ended, he stood up slowly, walked to the window overlooking the city lights, and said, "Get me the financial records of the Ministry of Security. Now." The truth was out. The country was watching. And Traoré had just decided this fight wasn't over. By midnight, the presidential palace was still lit. While most of Ouagadougou slept, President Ibrahim Traoré was wide awake, poring over files and maps. He wasn't just reviewing military strategy. He was tracing the money trail behind the scandal that now had his entire country watching. A stack of financial documents arrived at his desk just after 1 a.m. Coffee in hand, he went page by page. The budget for police modernization? Approved. Patrol cars? Paid for. Tactical gear and radios? Signed off. But the delivery logs were empty. Nothing had arrived. Instead, the funds had bounced through a chain of shell companies, disappearing into offshore accounts registered to vague consultants. One company was based in Dubai, a firm created just 2 days before the money was transferred. The owner? A man sharing the same last name as Minister Dio. It wasn't just corruption. It was organized theft, carried out in broad daylight, under Traoré's watch. His jaw tightened. This wasn't about embarrassment. This was about betrayal. Traoré had trusted Dio, placed him in power to rebuild the country's fragile institutions. But instead of building, Dio had been stealing. And worse, he had publicly destroyed the one man who dared to speak up. By sunrise, Traoré had made a decision. He picked up the phone, not to call the press, not to alert his ministers. He called the head of the National Gendarmerie. "Prepare a full unit," he said. "We're holding a cabinet meeting this morning. Not in the palace. At the Central Police Precinct. And make sure Minister Dio is there. Tell him to wear his best suit." As news broke that the president would visit the precinct, the city stirred. Speculation ran wild. Was Traoré going to punish the station for leaking the video? Was he there to restore order, or make an example? Seu Kone, meanwhile, had no idea what was coming. He had just made peace with the idea of selling his motorcycle to buy food for the month when a black military vehicle pulled up outside his home. 2 soldiers stepped out. Not aggressive, but serious. One of them saluted. "Officer Kone. You are requested at the precinct." Immediately. His wife, Aminata, panicked. "Are they arresting you?" "I don't know," Seu whispered. "But the president is involved." As the vehicle carried him through the waking streets of Ouagadougou, Seu stared out the window, unsure whether he was headed for redemption, or ruin. But as they approached the precinct gates, he saw something that made his breath catch. Hundreds of civilians were outside. Holding signs. Chanting his name. Justice for Kone. Truth is not treason. He was no longer the disgraced cop in socks. He was now a symbol. A mirror to the nation's conscience. Inside the courtyard, the same dusty space where he had been humiliated just days earlier, something extraordinary was unfolding. Officers were lined up in full formation. Minister Dio was already there, sweating, fidgeting, clearly nervous. "Why is the president coming here?" he barked at aides. "Who told him? What is this about?" Then, the gates swung open, the presidential convoy rolled in. And out stepped President Ibrahim Traoré. Not in a suit, not in ceremony, but in full military fatigues. Red beret. Boots. Face unreadable. He walked past the cameras. Past the crowd. Past the stunned officers. Straight into the center of the courtyard. And he spoke just once. "I have some questions of my own." What followed would not be a press conference. It would be a reckoning. And Minister Dio was about to face the consequences he never thought possible. The courtyard was silent. Not a phone rang. Not a shoe scraped the ground. Even the wind seemed to pause as President Ibrahim Traoré stepped into the formation of frozen officers and locked eyes with Minister Dio. Dio looked like a man who had suddenly realized the stage was no longer his. Traoré didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand or bang the podium. He simply gestured to his aide, who stepped forward and handed him a thick folder. The rustle of papers echoed through the silence like thunder. "Minister Dio," Traoré said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "You stood here yesterday and told these officers that the budget had been spent. You claimed modernization was underway." He flipped a page. On March 4, 300 million francs were allocated for 50 new patrol vehicles. "Can you show me those vehicles now?" Dio stammered. Wiped sweat from his temple. "Mr. President, with respect, the process is slow. Global supply chains. Customs delays." Traoré didn't blink. "That's strange," he said, flipping another page. "Because according to the customs log I pulled this morning, no shipment ever arrived." He paused. "But I did find something else. A wire transfer of 300 million francs to a consulting firm in Dubai. A firm created just 2 days before the money left our treasury." The crowd murmured. "And the listed owner of that firm happens to share your last name." Gasps cut through the formation. Dio froze. His legs trembled slightly. "It's not what it looks like," Dio said quickly. "It's a holding company. A financial strategy for long-term investments in security." "I understand theft," Traoré snapped. "And I understand this." He pointed behind him, at Officer Seu Kone, who stood still in his civilian clothes. "While you wired millions overseas, he was patrolling on foot. While you wore gold watches, his men were taping their boots together." Traoré stepped closer. Dio backed into the podium. "You fired this man," the president said, voice like steel. "You humiliated him for asking where the money went. You called him a traitor." He paused. Looked at the assembled officers. Then directly at the news cameras now broadcasting live to the entire country. "But looking at these documents, I only see one traitor here." Dio's eyes darted around, searching for an ally. His aides stared at the floor. The station commander wouldn't meet his gaze. Even the guard standing at the edge of the courtyard didn't move. He was completely alone. "I demand due process," Dio said desperately. "This is political. This is a spectacle." "You demanded respect," Traoré said. "But you disrespected the people. You disrespected the uniform." He turned back to the cameras. "Let this be known, in Burkina Faso, the days of the untouchable big man are over. If you steal from the people, your title will not save you. Then, Traore's voice dropped to a near whisper, but somehow it was louder than a shout. Minister Dio. You are relieved of your duties. Effective immediately. Dio sagged. The weight of the moment finally hitting him. But he thought that was it. A public firing. Humiliation, yes, but survivable. He began unbuttoning his suit, preparing to step down and slink away. Until Traore raised his hand and pointed. Do not let him leave. Gasps rippled again. The military police at the perimeter stepped forward. Dio panicked. Mr. President, I accept the dismissal. I am leaving peacefully. I have rights. I demand a lawyer. You're not going home, Traore said, his voice colder than steel. You stole 300 million francs. You do not get to walk away. Then, turning to Officer Seu Kone, Traore gave an order no one saw coming. Officer Kone, he said, nodding with gravity. You are a sworn officer of the law. You've just witnessed a confession of corruption. You know the procedure. Traore pointed at Dio. Arrest him. A silence followed that felt like the entire nation holding its breath. Seu froze for a heartbeat. Then he reached for his belt, the same belt they had forced him to strip just 24 hours earlier. The old handcuffs, the ones he had bought with his own money, were still there. He walked toward Dio. Dio flinched. You can't touch me. I have diplomatic immunity. I demand. You have the right to remain silent, Seu said firmly. And I suggest you use it. Click. 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 The handcuffs locked around Dio's wrists. The courtyard exploded. Officers broke formation. Caps flew into the air. The roar of approval shook the walls. After years of silence, fear, and fatigue, something had shifted. Something real. Traore raised a hand, and the noise stopped instantly. He stepped up to the microphone one last time. Minister Dio will not go to a VIP cell. He will not eat special meals. He will be sent to central lockup like any criminal who steals from the people. Then, he pulled out one final document. And one more thing. All of Dio's assets, the cars, the villa, the accounts, have been seized. That money is already being transferred back to the Ministry of Security. He turned to the officers. Your new patrol cars will be ordered tomorrow. Your new boots are on the way. Then, he looked at Seu. Nodded. A silent salute. And just like that, the balance of power in Burkina Faso had shifted. As the last echoes of celebration faded across the courtyard, President Ibrahim Traoré turned toward the man who had started it all, Officer Seu Kone. Still in his civilian clothes, standing quietly in the same dusty spot where he was stripped of his dignity the day before, Seu looked stunned. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. Even now, with Dio in handcuffs, he seemed unsure if this was real. But Traoré wasn't finished. He turned to the station commander. Where is Officer Kone's uniform? He asked. The commander, who had hesitated when ordered to fire Seu, now sprang into motion. In the evidence locker, sir. Get it. The man ran. Moments later, he returned with the folded blue shirt, the faded beret, the badge that had once gleamed on Seu's chest. He handed it to the president with trembling hands. Traoré took the uniform, unfolded it slowly, and held it up, not like a piece of clothing, but like a medal. Then he turned to Seu. Officer Kone, he said, voice steady. Put it on. Seu's hands shook as he reached for the shirt. He slipped his arms through the sleeves, buttoned it one by one, each click of the button a step toward healing. He placed the beret on his head, his fingers fumbling slightly. And finally, he took the badge, and pinned it back on his chest. His shoulders straightened. His chin lifted. The tears came, but this time, they were not of shame, they were of honor. The crowd erupted again, but this time not in anger or protest, but in pride. And in that moment, under the morning sun, amidst the smell of dust, sweat, and justice, Seu Kone became more than just a police officer. He became a symbol. The arrest of Minister Dio wasn't just a headline. It was a detonation. The shockwaves rippled far beyond the courtyard of the Central Police Precinct. They reached every dusty outpost, every broken-down patrol car, every overlooked public office. And suddenly, across Burkina Faso, the culture began to shift. Just 3 days after the arrest, Officer Seu Kone's phone rang. It wasn't a politician. It wasn't a reporter. It was a young border patrol agent stationed 400 miles away. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from adrenaline. "I stopped a man trying to smuggle gold across the border," he said. "He offered me more than I make in a year. Before, I might have taken it. But then I saw your video. I saw the president stand behind you. So today, I said,